and he has consulted widely on the issue. And so we're very lucky to have him to moderate a very distinguished panel. So thank you, Robert, and thank you to the panelists. Some are going to join in a couple of minutes. One couldn't join, the former acting mayor of Kabul, was not able to make it this morning, but we should have all the other panelists, and I'm pleased to see on the panel already Stephanie Ziebell, who knows a lot about Haiti, and Port-au-Prince is a major challenge in terms of city renovation and stabilization, and also the former mayor of Bogota, very distinguished politician from Colombia, Enrique Peñalosa, who has done so much for his city, and so we are very glad and grateful that he is with us this morning. And I see Sameh Wahba has also just joined, so we'll have the Bretton Woods institutions on board too, and they play an important role in supporting programs in cities. So we're very grateful also to have Sameh Wahba, and Yvonne from Freetown should join us anytime. So I will hand over to Robert, and when the time comes from Q&A, for Q&A, and I can tell Robert that this is a very dynamic audience, which always has very good questions. So keep some time for the Q&As. You will have a panoramic view of the audience, but that may not be enough. So I will identify people to convey to you so that they can convey their questions to you. So over to you, Robert.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, in spite of this ominous news about COVID. And apologies, I think, on all of our behalf for not being with you, but we're really excited to be able to have a chance to speak with you today. We have a sterling panel assembled, and some who are still coming, and I'll sort of take my time doing a quick introduction to hopefully have them all on the line by the time we move into the conversation. But we're here really to discuss the challenges of insecurity in our cities. And I think, as all of you know, sitting there in New York and coming from your various locations, all cities, big and small, are affected by crime and violence and various forms of conflict, some more obviously than others. And this is a very significant and growing concern across the Americas in lower and upper income things alike. Our goal here today with you is not just, I think, to focus on the causes and consequences of insecurity, which we will do, but also, more importantly, to focus on solutions to improve safety and security at the city scale. And the really positive news is that there's growing evidence of what works, and some of our colleagues on this call are going to be discussing that. A key question that gets often sidelined when we're talking about solutions is, how do they emerge? And how are solutions sustained over time? It's one thing to come up with a good idea, it's quite another to be able to ensure its financing and its continuation and support for it. Does it come down to enlightened and progressive mayors, including some of whom we're going to have on this call? Is it about well-heeled business people? Is it about active NGOs and international agencies that get the ball rolling and sustain it? Some people, I think, including folks in this panel, talk of this golden triangle, this idea of a public, private, and civic interaction that can give rise to some innovative solutions. In this morning session, we're going to focus on cities as our unit of analysis, as opposed to, say, nations or states or provinces. And this makes sense when we're talking about crime and violence and conflict. Cities are both a site and an object of violence. This is precisely where people are highly concentrated, and cities serve as these nodes of political and economic and cultural power and opportunity. So it makes sense that we see an aggregation there at one level. We're going to touch on multiple forms of violence, I hope, during the course of this conversation. We're going to be speaking about Bogota first and foremost, Freetown and Philly and Port-au-Prince. And we're going to see, I think, overlapping types of violence in these settings. The perpetrators are wide-ranging, from gangs and militia and the more spectacular mafia types to neighbors, intimate partners, domestic, and of course, state agents. And despite the obvious differences between the cities on this panel, be it Bogota, Port-au-Prince, and Freetown, and Philly, these conceptual classifications of being at war or not at war, or in a post-conflict situation, they tend to sort of fade away a little bit when you take a closer look at the drivers of insecurity. And I think that the hopeful point here is that cities offer real opportunities to test out our solutions, our measures, to scale them and to deliver results. And one of the reasons for that is that our city leaders are pragmatic. They're prepared to experiment with what works. The private sectors in many cities tend to like to see material outcomes, and city residents offer important contributions and real-time feedback to help determine how effective or non-effective a particular intervention is. Without sort of overly romanticizing cities, because cities are conflicted and contested spaces, there are some virtuous feedback loops that often arise. So while there are deep historical and cultural differences between cities, often the risk and protective factors shaping urban violence and victimization are quite common or similar. Whether you're in Bogota or whether you're in Port-au-Prince or whether you're in Philly or Freetown, the built environment matters. Green spaces, block layout, street lighting, even the nature of buildings matters. Youth unemployment and undereducation and peer networks and parenting matters. Inequality is a strong leading indicator, and so is concentrated disadvantage, as well as high churn in neighborhoods. And of course, policing and the relationships between police and communities matters. So my starting point here, and I think hopefully one that we're going to build on over the course of the conversation, is that there's some good news in this gloomy world of ours. And it's that the hyper concentration of most forms of violence make it quite treatable, much like you would treat a disease. Violence tends to be concentrated in high-risk places amongst at-risk people, and is often associated with very risky types of behavior. And there are a lot of examples of this in places like Bogota or Medellin. The vast majority of violence, certainly lethal violence, occurs in a tiny quotient of the city. Most forms of criminality are committed by a relatively small proportion of the population. There are a certain set of behavioral attributes that are most highly correlated with violence. So the good news is that, if we minimize risk factors and maximize protective factors, we may have a better ability to be able to tackle this challenge. And we're learning about what kinds of protective factors work. Strategies like focused deterrence, cognitive behavioral therapy, affordable housing, green spaces, parks, community meeting places, community-based organizations. All of these have strong empirical connections to bringing violence down. The other good news is that there's an incipient but growing movement globally and regionally to address violence in our cities. As all of you know in this room, the UN agreed on SDG 16 several years ago with commitments to reduce violence everywhere. But what we've seen in the meantime are international city networks like the Global Parliament of Mayors and others that are calling for halving violence, that is to say, cutting violence dramatically within the next 10 years. And we're starting to see investments following those pledges. And cities are innovating and pioneering techniques. Not enough, obviously, but awareness is growing. And the final bit of positive news that we're going to really be focusing on today is that we have many promising examples of cities that didn't just reduce urban violence, but did it in a dramatic fashion and sustain these gains over time. And I think the cases of Bogota, Medellin, and others stand out through a really creative combination of rethinking policing, community action, redesign of city landscapes. And we're seeing this also, even despite the gloomy picture in the United States of similar kinds of dividends in spite of the last 2 years, with steady declines since the 1980s. So we have hopefully five, if we're all on, and hopefully will join us if they're late, 5 stellar panels today. We have Enrique Peñalosa, a 2-time mayor of Bogota in the 1998 to 2001, and again in 2016 to 2019. We'll have, if we have not already, Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr, who's the mayor of Freetown since 2018. We hope to be joined, if he's not here already, by Michael Nutter, who is a 2-time mayor of Philadelphia from 2008 to 2016, and now a professor at Columbia. We have Stephanie Ziebell, who's a deputy resident rep at UNDP and a long-time Haiti watcher coming to us from Port-au-Prince. And we have Sameh Wahba, who's formerly the head of the urban practice of the World Bank and now has just recently shifted positions to lead the reconstruction, certainly the urban reconstruction in large parts of Ukraine. So we're going to break our panel into two parts. The first session is going to involve each of our panelists responding essentially to two basic questions, and we're going to take up about 45 to 50 minutes, hopefully, to do that. The second part of the panel is going to be a Q&A. We have a lively group. We hope we'll have a lively group, so I think we're going to look forward to some fulsome conversation. So I think, Jean-Marie, you said that you'll be our sort of co-chair in this exercise, helping guide some of those questions if we can't see them. So just let's get right into it. And I want to start with the first question, which is to sort of set the scene and to ask a little bit about what are the causes and the effects of urban violence in the four cities, that we're going to be focusing on today. And I want to start with you, Enrique. If you could just give us a few minutes to lay out the scene in Bogota as you saw it, and some of the underlying drivers and how you, as a mayor, two-time mayor, sort of approached and conceived and understood the challenges in your city.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. There are many. Bogota, first of all, has had over the last 25 years or so a very large reduction in crime, and we will measure crime in the most obvious ways: murders per 100,000 inhabitants, and we went like from something like 70 or more to now. In my last time as mayor, we were able to bring it. We received it in. I just finished my last time in 2019. We were able to bring it down from 17 to 12 murders per 100. That's much lower than many American cities, like much lower than Washington or many others. Still is very high, and there is, of course, much crime. We have difficult situations like a huge immigration of poor Venezuelans, and some of them are criminals. And this has this is 500,000 immigrants just to Bogota, more. So, but anyway, I will go very quickly because we have 2 minutes now. I will talk about two things. One, legitimacy. I believe legitimacy is crucial. Legitimacy is a very difficult concept to establish, but legitimacy, when there is legitimacy in the social organization, people obey the laws. Legitimacy does not mean that you have reached a certain income per capita or infant mortality rate, but that people perceive that the society, the state is not corrupt, that it seeks more equality, that if there is legitimacy, people, for example, they pick up the trash in the streets, or they denounce the criminals, they help the police, they are in the side of the state. And for legitimacy, there must be, for example, we built, for example, before any city, notwithstanding Denmark or Holland, we were first, before almost any other city in the world, to do a huge network of bikeways. A bikeway is a symbol of equality because it shows a citizen on a $30 bicycle is equally important to one on a $30,000 car. Our BRT system, the bus system, is very powerful in constructing equality because you can have the $200,000 car stuck in traffic, as is often the case, or most of the time the case, and the bus zooms by, the public transport zooms by with lower income people. So unconsciously, this constructs legitimacy. Fantastic schools in the poorest neighborhoods, which are giant libraries, or sports and cultural centers with Olympic swimming pools and gyms and music centers and all of this is important. For example, parks. In the last time, we made about 1,500 parks, and then we made, for example, 170 synthetic fields, soccer fields with lighting. And there is a study, an independent study by the most important university in Colombia, University of Los Andes, which found that a very large area around the soccer fields, crime went down. Because, of course, around the young people, instead of doing drugs or doing other useless things, they are doing sports, and then young people doing sports in public space is not a good environment for criminals, because they may get in trouble with the young people. So there is a huge reduction in crime thanks to these parks. Also, people in this public space. People in public space is the most important thing for security. And then parks and high quality public space, lighting, good sidewalks. I mean, I was almost impeached for getting cars off the sidewalks and making sidewalks and bikeways and so, but all of these things also construct equality. When only 20% of households have cars, to have cars parked on sidewalks is also a symbol of inequality, of lack of respect for citizens. So to get cars off the sidewalks, to give priority to public transport, to do bikeways, to do parks, all constructs equality, and constructs what I was saying is legitimacy. There are other, you mentioned in passing, the building design is also very important. It's horrible when you begin to get gated communities all over the place, and even worse so when buildings in developing countries, very often they have parking in the first and second floor, and so that when people walk by, they only have cars in front of them, or a blind wall. So it's a perfect place for crime, or a wall. So it's important to have windows open into the public space, and people, apartments or shops in the public space, shops in buildings. All of these things are also other things that are very obvious, which has been mentioned many times, the famous broken window and all that. That's true. I mean, I do believe that the cleanliness, we also increase, for example, we changed the light bulbs in all of the city, especially the public spaces, and they were almost 3 times brighter than those former. And this is also cleanliness, lighting, good maintenance, because if there is disorder, and of course with communities, we organize communities sometimes to go to the most dangerous areas, to go and to take over. We would talk to take over these areas. In one time, for example, in Bogota, I mean, it's so long, but I don't know if I have time. You interrupt me whenever you want.
Take another 30 seconds, just for the anecdote.
Okay. For example, we have in Bogota a very nice ritual. Every Sunday, we close about 120 kilometers of main roads, and we get, in a sunny day, we may get up to 2 million people in the street, riding bicycles, jogging, and so we started to do this at night, one night or a few nights, and then this is why it's like a community conquest of the night, and everybody with bicycles and everything, and there is almost zero crime. So all of these things are important. Now, not to say, to finish, that of course it's necessary to have an excellent police, especially intelligence, because most crime that we face is organized crime. It's not somebody who was hungry and went out to steal so they bring food to the grandmother. No. So it's organizations. And these organizations are not very easily combated with uniformed police, but more with intelligence. And so these are some of the things that we did.
Enrique, thank you so much. I have to say, first of all, I'm an enormous fan of your work and your commitment and your innovation. It's sort of celebrated globally. But your words are very effective. I worked in Colombia in the 90s, in Planación Nacional, and lived in Bogota between 97 and 99. And I remember when I first arrived, the streets were desolate. There was nobody in the streets. There was gunfire in some of the quarters. It was people would drive 100 miles an hour and go through red lights because there's green lights because it's too terrifying to stop at red lights. And the only park in the entire city that was open was Park 93, which was a square off Septima, the main avenue. And everybody in the city seemed to be on that one tiny little park. They'd all come out because it was the only place people felt safe. And in the space of about a decade or so, huge transformations under yours and other leadership. And you signaled so many factors, which I won't try to repeat, but I think are going to come up in other people's interventions, but around history, lack of respect for institutions, inequality, and the importance of natural surveillance. And you've already gone into solutions, as I expected you would. So we're going to come back to you to talk a bit more about some of the innovations that you tested out and some of the experiences. But before we do, I'd like to turn to Stephanie to give us a little bit of an overview of the scene in Port-au-Prince. Very different environment, obviously, but probably has some commonalities. And then we're going to move to Michael Nutter, who's joined us. I'm going to give Michael a chance to catch his breath before we talk about Philadelphia. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Robert, and I hope you can hear me. Let me know if the audio cracks for any reason. Terrific, thanks. I think this panel is really interesting because I think we're going to see photographs or images of situations that are at different stages in terms of dynamics of violence. For those of you who follow Haiti, I would say we're actually have an inverse trend compared to what Enrique just presented. Between 2006 and 2012, we saw in general, say an improvement in the overall situation when it comes to urban violence in Port-au-Prince. Now, just as a reminder, Haiti has about 54% of its population living in urban areas, primarily in Port-au-Prince. Demographically, the population is about 55% of people under the age of 25. And historically, we've seen very little effort when it comes to deconcentration and decentralization, which means that there continues to be a draw towards urban areas, particularly the capital. What we see right now in 2022 is almost a doubling of homicide and kidnappings since the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years. We are now at a level of homicides and kidnappings that exceeds the worst point in recent history, which was in 2006. So while we had an improvement trend for, let's say, 2005, 2006 to 2012, 2013, since 2013, and especially since 2018, we have seen a deepening in the political and the security crisis impacting the capital primarily. I'll maybe do a little bit of a parenthesis to echo a little bit of what Enrique mentioned, which had to do with equalizers, confidence, public space. Robert, you mentioned the Golden Triangle. And I think maybe there was a small window of opportunity between 2013 and 2014, where efforts between the public and the private sector were made in order to create public spaces. For example, the National Police had a bicycle brigade, which I think was a very symbolic gesture to show that the streets were safe enough for people, especially police officers, to navigate, to move around, to be in touch much more, this proximity with the population in different neighborhoods. And unfortunately, we've seen a reversing of that trend. And my question that I'm asking myself, and I'm very interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about what worked in other spaces, is maybe where in that Golden Triangle did we not get things right in that window of opportunity that we had maybe 8 years ago? And was it because there wasn't enough of a civic space that was created, a civic voice to put the third leg of the triangle, to make it more solid? And now we see that the private and the public actors are actually those, without being too politically incorrect, those that seem to be at the root of some of these causes of a deepening political and social and economic crisis, which have allowed organized gangs to capitalize on this vacuum that we have now in Port-au-Prince. And just a couple of statistics on that, we have approximately 160 gangs that are active in Haiti, the majority of which are in the Port-au-Prince area. As of today, gangs have cut off connection between the capital and the north of the country, the capital and the east of the country, which is the border with the Dominican Republic and a primary commercial route and a transportation route. Gangs have cut off. Actually, it's been over a year now since access to the south has been almost completely cut off. And the port area is under, I would say, not gang control, but heavily impacted by gang activity. So we have a capital that is essentially under siege, where movement around the country is extremely limited, if not impossible. And we have the phenomenon of extortion for movement, which affects, small, medium, large businesses. We have the customs, which is not able to function regularly, which means there's an impact on tax revenue when it comes to importation. We're not able to really have movement between us and our neighbor in the Dominican Republic. So I would say the moment is quite critical, and it's sad to see that there's been a reversing in what had been a stabilization trend in recent years. Yeah, I think maybe I'll start there and stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on, but mostly I'm interested to hear what has worked and what are some of the solutions that have worked for other countries. We have a couple of innovations, and maybe most poignantly, right after the August 14th earthquake in 2021, we were able, when I say we, it's a number of actors, but there was a National Disarmament Commission that worked together with humanitarian actors, local and national government, to negotiate a humanitarian corridor towards the south. And to kind of put a pause in the violence that had effectively cut off access to the earthquake affected area. That was something that had not happened in the past. Previous efforts to negotiate humanitarian corridors had not been successful. Somehow it worked this time. Unfortunately, it was temporary, but it did relieve some of the most acute humanitarian needs for a very short period of time. Yeah, happy to listen to what other experiences are in terms of solutions and innovations, so we can maybe start stemming the trend that we're seeing right now. Thanks so much, Robert.
Thanks, Stephanie. And you're operating in an unbelievably challenging setting. We were going to have the mayor of Kabul, ex-mayor of Kabul as well, on to reflect on that. And I've also been speaking with the former mayor of Mogadishu to sort of reflect on these situations where we have this combination of sort of state collapse, or at least state erosion, or a state that's unable and in some cases unwilling to engage, where the legitimacy challenges, I think, that Enrique raised as well, are reign dominant, where you have enormous wrenching disadvantage, concentrated disadvantage in particular neighborhoods, and a very high youth population that are not seeing their horizons particularly in a positive light. Coupled with sort of this legacies of waves of challenges. And I think it's a really difficult environment in which to kind of imagine opportunities and solutions. And yet there are many. So I'm going to give you a chance to come back a bit, Stephanie, in addition to listening, to come back and maybe reflect also later about what have been some of the efforts that have been undertaken in Port-au-Prince over the last couple of years to try to alleviate or address or stem some of these challenges. And there have been many. And I think it's important to reflect not just on the good stories, but also those interventions that maybe haven't yielded the kind of outcomes that were hoped for or expected, and maybe just reflect a bit on why that might be the case. So we'll come back to you, and we'll certainly have a more lively conversation. But before we do, Michael, you came in a bit late. The question, really great to see you. Hugely inspired by the work you've done over the last decades, both in office and out of it. And you and I met some years ago in Chicago, talking about this very topic, and now it's front and center on the agenda in the United States. Yeah. The question really is can you give us a little sort of overview of Philly and frankly just the American urban scene, since you're a thinker beyond, and maybe some reflections on what's driving it. We'll get to solutions. We're going to talk about the extraordinary stuff you've been doing, but give us a lay of the land as you see it.
Sure. So first and foremost, good morning, Robert. So great to see you, and of course all of the other panelists. I apologize for signing in late. I was in conflict with my computer. And so that's the first conflict that I'm dealing with here today. We were at a fight. I was losing most of the time. So, Robert, I'd like to frame it for my conversation this way. I want to take people back, not too far back in the Wayback Machine, but just 2.5 years ago. There are 5 things that have led to an exacerbation of conflict in cities all across the United States of America. A worldwide pandemic, severe fiscal distress at the local and state level, massive national and worldwide racial reckoning is often the term that's used. One of the most bizarre elections in modern US history, in November of 2020. And what I refer to now is the 13th month of 2020, an insurrection. 5 significant events, any one of which would singularly be significant in America. But in 13 months, those 5 things happened. In Philadelphia, prior to the pandemic, but not often talked about, crime and violence, homicides and shootings in particular, which are more often the measurement of what's going on from a public safety standpoint or conflict. 17, 18, and 19, homicides and shootings were already up year over year, all 3 of those years before any of us were talking about the word pandemic. The pandemic, forcing people to stay home, forcing businesses to close, stay-at-home orders, fear of death and disease from anybody that you might walk near, including family members, only made things that much worse. And so we are still suffering with most of those things. The pandemic is not over. Cities and states are still suffering financially. Race is still, race, discrimination, all those issues have not left us. For some, the 2020 election is not over. And we are literally now having hearings in the Congress on the January 6th insurrection. All of these issues are still present and front and center, and conflict is on the rise. Now we have a war on the other side of the world, and some people may or may not know where the Ukraine is or the Soviet Union, but people are feeling that pressure. And so we've gone from defund the police to fund the police, right? Many, many jurisdictions, including Philadelphia, that movement, that level of challenge was very, very present 2020 and 2021. What's happened since? 12 cities broke their own records in terms of homicides across the country, including Philadelphia. The public said, we want to be safe, was part of, I would say, the electoral success of Eric Adams in New York City. You saw the recall of a quote unquote progressive district attorney in San Francisco. Significant conflict here in Philly about our own district attorney, considered quote unquote a progressive, while we hit a 60+ year high in 2021. We had more murders in Philadelphia than the good folks sitting in the 15th floor SIPA in New York than New York City. And so the bottom line for me and many others is safety is number one. Everyone wants to be safe. And so this is what we're seeing. This is the movement and the cry from people in cities all across the United States of America. If you're a Democratic mayor, Republican mayor, independent, the Pluto party, right? Your number one responsibility is to make sure your citizens are safe. And that is, in my view, that's what's really taking place. And people are pushing back on some of the efforts of the past few years because safety is number one.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I agree 100% that these big exogenous shocks are exacerbating some pre-existing conditions, let's say. One thing that's worth noting, just even if you were to go back even further in the Wayback Machine that you brought out and dusted off, is that there has also been a dramatic decline in most forms of urban violence across most U.S. cities, going back to the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, one of the most stunning declines, a bit similar to Colombia, with some of the big declines in Bogota, Medellin, and elsewhere, which had these long sweeping declines. And while it's been an unbelievably dramatic increase, and I would add, by the way, that the 40 million firearms that were purchased over the last 2 years is possibly being another contributing factor, especially amongst first-time users. But the recent increase, as dramatic as it's been, is still not as high as it was in the 90s. But as you say, the agenda of insecurity and security is now sort of at the top of the agenda, along with interest rates and inflation, right, and the price of meat. So I think that's a really poignant set of reflections. We're going to come back to you because I know also, Michael, you along with the others led some really innovative strategies, that are kind of nationally recognized for bringing violence down in Philly, and I want to get down to those in a moment, but thanks for setting the stage. Yvonne, really so great to see you. I was worried we wouldn't have you. I think you were probably dueling with your machine as well. But I'm going to head over to you, Yvonne. The question, because you missed the intro, is really just give us a sense from where you're sitting in Freetown. First of all, of course, welcome. But give us a sense and understand sort of the situation of urban insecurity. What are some of the drivers as you see it in Freetown and or other cities, big and large, large and small in Sierra Leone? And then we're going to get to solutions in the second half. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's good to see you and good to see everyone else on the call. It was really interesting listening to Stephanie because I felt like I was hearing about my own city when she was speaking about Haiti. The population dynamics, the fact that I've got 65% of my population under the age of 35, the violence, the high levels of unemployment. But what I would add to that is that we have a situation where we've had a convergence of lack of decentralization, which Stephanie mentioned, which means that there is this pull into the urban areas. But the other factor, which I think is important to mention, is that we had a civil war between 1991 and 2001, and there were young people who grew up, experienced their youth age, their teenage age in the midst of conflict. And even though there was a process of disarmament and there was a process of supposed reintegration, that bulk of young people, both male and female, because the child soldiers were from both genders, but particularly male, are always there. They're always within society, and it doesn't take much for them to be triggered and for them to revert to a violent reaction. So we've got this sort of, and it's not something that I feel as a society and with successive national governments, is not something I think that's really been addressed. The underlying emotional post-traumatic stress that these young people have had to live with, and how that then plays out in terms of violence within the urban space. As a city, we are known, actually, we were known until the war, and then even post the war, interestingly enough, as one of the most peaceful countries on the continent. We had low levels of crime, where there's a real sort of warmth and hospitality. This is a city where most people come and they always want to come back because everybody talks to you, everybody engages, everybody, I hear this all the time. Sometimes I feel it's a bit patronizing, but it is true. Everyone's always smiling, which is really interesting given what is so, real beneath the surface. Crime, when we have had it, has been mainly muggings, robberies, but over the last 4 years, there's definitely been an increase of violent crime, along with a deterioration of the economy. And the Ukraine, the post-COVID, all of these things, we have seen in the last 3 months, the price of fuel, as others have experienced, double, more than double now. We've seen our exchange rate plummet. So even the middle class, 50% poorer. What you would have been able to buy in January, you can only buy half of that now in June. And that's really affecting everyone. And it means that violent crime is on the increase. We're seeing more house break-ins. We're seeing more armed robberies. We have traditionally had an unspoken but now more exposed problem with gender-based violence. And that again is very much on the increase, and with a lot of, sort of very violent gender crimes. And then we also have I suppose, just a general feeling of unease, which sadly is being stoked by a political narrative of division. So we find ourselves in a very tricky time. I've never, I grew up in the city. I grew up walking in the woods. I mean, like literally walking in the woods at night with not a care in the world. And even as recently as 5 years ago, I would walk on the beach at night. Everybody did. I didn't need security. This last March 2021, I was mugged on the beach at knife point at 6:30 in the morning. The jury's out as to whether or not that was a genuine mugging or if there was more to it than that. But, I know that even just in the past few days, I'm aware, and I know of, someone who was mugged not at knife point, but with a cutlass. So the tension is rising as the economy is shrinking. And there's an increased sense of helplessness and hopelessness for young people. I think I'll stop there. That's painted a very bleak picture, but it actually is what we're experiencing at the moment.
Thank you, Yvonne. That is chilling. And I know we'll get a chance to come back to some of the...
Sorry, I should also say drug abuse. That's another element of the mix. So again, for the last 4 years, we have seen an escalation since 2018, an escalation with drug use, drug availability, and that obviously has ramifications for violence.
We're going to come back to that as well in terms of solutions. And I think the two takeaways I take, Yvonne, from your review is first that violence is not a permanent condition. Insecurity is not a permanent condition. It fluctuates over time, and you've kind of seen these ebbs and troughs. And like you and Stephanie both described situations that had been slightly better, we're now seeing a deterioration. Bogota went from an unbelievably difficult challenge down to an extraordinary situation where it was actually doing better than many American cities. And I think the US is seeing also this extraordinary spike. The second factor, which is connected, is and it kind of resonates across all these interventions so far, is that the risk factors are both exogenous and endogenous. I mean, there are these external shocks that both you and Michael and Stephanie and, well, in fact, all of you, Enrique talked about around inflation, around economic conditions, around the prices that fluctuate, which are essentially outside of the control of the city. And then there's all these internal factors around the built environment, youth, substance abuse, concentrated disadvantage, inequality. I want to hand over to Sameh to give us a little bit of a kind of high-level overview as somebody who's presided over these discussions in many different settings, to reflect a bit on how do you see things, Sameh, at 30,000 feet, having worked in many cities, having lived in many of these cities, and thinking about some of the underlying factors that are shaping violence. And then we're going to switch very quickly to the more positive side of the equation to talk about solutions. But over to you, Sameh, to give us some high-level perspective.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Great to be with you and with such a great panel. I think we've heard the detailed story, if you want, of 4 different cities from the north, from the south. And so maybe, let me take a couple of steps back. And I just want to start by differentiating, if you will, 2 dimensions of, which is differentiating between conflict, armed conflict, with its impact, mostly at country level, whether displacing people within a country, across countries, versus when we get within a city and we're talking at the intra-city level about issues related to urban crime and violence, because they have different drivers and they have different implications on cities. So I think, and then we can get to the household level when we get into gender-based violence, etc. But let's stick to the first 2, which have a bit more of a beyond the household level. So I think at the country level, when we're talking about armed conflict that would lead to forcefully displacing people internally within a country, I mean, think Yemen, think Syria, I mean, earlier Colombia, Philippines with Mindanao, etc. And then there are obviously those armed conflicts that do spill out beyond their country boundaries and then therefore displace peoples across countries, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, etc. And the impact on urban areas is twofold. I mean, the urban areas that are actually affected by the conflict, the places that are shelled, that are bombed, whose infrastructure is destroyed, whose housing, businesses, economic activities, livelihoods, etc., are affected. And what's happening in Ukrainian cities as we speak, Mariupol, for instance, a city that has suffered severe destruction, earlier Iraq and Mosul, etc. And then the cities that suffer because the displacement, of people leads to a major influx within these cities. So, the city of Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, itself has grown in 15 years from 80,000 to about 1.2 million, mainly driven by conflict. And then, of course, Lebanese and Jordanian cities, which have doubled, literally within a year with Syrian refugees, cities like Byblos, etc. And of course, Polish cities right now, especially a city like Warsaw, that has, probably doubled in population, if not more. I mean, the numbers are so dynamic that they change by the day. Now here, obviously, the challenge in trying to resolve a little bit or tackle the issues within cities will differ a lot. I mean, how do you do reconstruction and recovery within cities that have been demolished, where there has been an exodus of people? Do you rebuild the cities as they were, for the sake of expediency, because you're going to have to accommodate back the population? Do you start thinking about build back better, about replanning these cities? Parts of them will have been, placed in flood-prone areas. Do you want to, reproduce the risk again? Do you want to think about more compactness? Basically decarbonizing the cities, etc. How do you bring about these dimensions? How do you tackle issues like, land and property rights, contested spaces, like you've mentioned, Rob, in the beginning? So I think all these challenges will need to be addressed. And then there are the cities that become the hosts for the refugees and the internally displaced, and we face, immense pressure on access to jobs, access to services, etc. And therefore, where any intervention will have to accommodate, if you will, the dual needs of the refugees, but also the host communities. And we've got places actually where refugees, get a better deal, if you want, because they're being attended to, could get a better deal, in terms of service delivery, access to opportunities, than the host communities and the ensuing dynamics that emerge. The other side is, if you will, that at a city or neighborhood level, urban crime and violence, caused either by, several of the speakers, including Yvonne, have spoken about some of the drivers of such urban crime and violence. Predominantly, it's about the absence of the state. It's about exclusion manifesting itself in multiple forms, spatial exclusion, in terms of access to land, access to housing, access to infrastructure and services, economic exclusion, lack of access to economic opportunities, and of course, social exclusion, lack of voice, accountability, and the ability to participate in shaping decisions. And when you take those various forms of exclusion combined, coupled with, an absence of the state, it causes, if you will, the fertile conditions for other orders to step in. And we're talking here, Enrique spoke about, Colombian cities, the Brazilian favelas, are other such examples where an alternative order steps in to conduct, if you will, dispute resolution, to conduct service delivery, to displace the state, and brings about, if you will, challenges related to mobility, access, the narco traffic, etc. And therefore, these conditions also, further exacerbate urban crime and violence at the neighborhood level, can spill over across the entire city. But these two dimensions are, very different. Their drivers are very different, drivers of conflict here versus the drivers of urban crime and violence there. And therefore, their solutions will also be very different. They'll have common ingredients about, access to economic opportunities, about citizen engagement, etc. But they'll also have their particular specificities. Let me stop here and back to you, Rob. So I see Rob frozen. I'm not sure if I was the one who lost.
No, I'm sorry.
Connectivity or you? Okay.
No, Sameh, sorry about that. I've been having a little drama here. I'm trying to organize my own computer. Thank you really for that brilliant overview and sort of distilling it down to a couple of the core drivers and differentiating, frankly, between the conflict and the other side. Let me just cancel my other camera. Here we go. So basically, as we kind of transition now, and we're going to move fairly swiftly to the second round, to reflect a bit on solutions and to build a little bit, Sameh, on your high-level comments and to kind of move towards how have we seen the Golden Triangle in a way emerge in practice. I want to circle back to you, Enrique, and you already, as a good and smart mayor would, already jumped right into the conclusions and into the recommendations and describing the importance of equity and equality and the symbolism, which I was always struck by in Colombia. I would love if you could reflect a little bit on sort of how did you design some of the solutions? How did you engineer the solutions as a mayor in a situation, as you said, of an environment that, yes, had seen some declines in crime and violence, but still was experiencing very, very high levels. And one where, just to build on Yvonne's point, and points have been raised by others, there was sort of an intergenerational transmission of violence. When you live in high stress environments, when you live in a history of a place, either the national, the hyperlocal scale, where there's been a constant exposure to violence, we now know that there are not just social and peer and network effects, but also physiological and neurological outcomes for young people in those high stress environments. How did you think about your solutions as a mayor? How did you bring people to the table? What were the processes by which you did that?
Well, I don't know if I understand well the question, but what I do believe is that, well, first I'd like to say once again that all of this we are talking about does not mean that the police and the jails are not important. This is very important, and a police that is mostly honest, not corrupt. In every area in Bogota where I went, everywhere, in the richest areas, in the poorest areas, in everywhere, people want always more police. I understand there are some countries or cities where the police is so corrupt or for whatever other reasons is not wanted there. No, everywhere in the city, the young children, many young children want to become policemen, and the people always, they ask for more police. Never they say, oh, the police are so corrupt, please get them out of here. Never I found this in my decades of political activity and my 2 times as mayor. So the police in Colombia is quite, of course there is corruption and all this in some cases. I'm not saying they're angels, but relatively they have community support. Second, the projects that we also have a system that is quite democratic in the sense that in the upper income level people, they pay on some of the highest property taxes anywhere. About 2% of the value of a property means something which can be between 1 and 3 monthly rentals. So we collect very high taxes, and nothing is invested in the rich areas because the upper income people don't use public education, they don't use public school, the public hospitals, public health, nurseries, nothing. So all the money that is collected in the upper income areas is invested in the lowest income areas. It's a very powerful redistribution machine and quite efficient despite all the problems that there might be. Also, there are other means of redistribution. For example, for utilities, people in an upper income neighborhood can pay 8-10 times more for water than the one in the lowest income area. So there is cross subsidies in the tariffs for public services. But there are some of these symbolic things that we are talking that are powerful for equality. I like to mention that, for example, jobs are mentioned. Some things that we did are very, we have to fight. There is conflict. To many of these things that I say very quickly, they imply huge conflict. As I mentioned, I was almost impeached for getting cars off the sidewalks or where there should be sidewalks. For example, we made beautiful schools. In my 2 terms as mayor, we built like more than 80 schools, but amazing schools that are more beautiful than the schools of the richest children. In the poorest neighborhoods, they are like temples. And also libraries. But this school, something even more important than the building, is that we got the best private schools and the best university to manage these schools. And of course, this is a huge conflict with the traditional union, teachers union, which really, because they always used to say, oh, poor children, they don't learn because they don't get enough food or their parents don't have books at home or whatever. But then what was proved with these schools, what we call concession school managed by the private schools and the university, is that in the poorest areas, we got results that are similar to those, comparable to those of the best private schools of the upper income people with the lowest income children. So clearly is the union is being an obstacle to improving the quality of education. And not only in these neighborhoods, the community supports crazily these schools. They really support them. And then they not only get amazing academic results, but also lower drug addiction rates, pregnancy rates, abandonment of school. So these things are effective, concrete, specific, and this is a team, let's say, with the private sector in a certain way. There are many things that we build more extraordinary infrastructure in the lower income neighborhoods. We also make housing projects, expansion. For example, it was mentioned about the favelas. I forgot, I'm sorry. And in Bogota, this is almost finished now. As in many, and in Brazil too, this is finished. It's more of an earlier era or the lower income, but now we made housing projects which have extraordinary urban design qualities, large sidewalks, lots of parks. We even, for example, made a bicycle highway, 24 kilometers long, 15 meters wide, lined with trees. And we made several of these, with like 150 kilometers of this kind of infrastructure. Bicycling, I think, is very powerful equalizer, because now Bogota is maybe one of the cities that has the most people on bicycles anywhere in the developing world, at least about 10% of when I first came as mayor, the first time, nobody used bicycles. And now about 10% of the population uses bicycles. And when somebody meets on a bicycle, maybe one bicycle is $5,000 or something, and the other one maybe $30. But then they are two human beings next to each other. This is very powerful. What you need in a city is that people don't feel inferior or excluded. And so many of these, I would say that there is better infrastructure in terms of parks, in terms of many things in lowest income neighborhoods than in the highest income neighborhoods.
Enrique, that's brilliant. And there's so much wrapped up in what you're saying. And I think all of us could listen for a long time, because there's so many innovations that you pioneered and your colleagues and your predecessors also pioneered. But I think that the underlying story, I think for me at least, is that you had a very clear vision and strategy around equity. And this idea of bringing the best to the poorest areas is an innovation I know from Rio, where I live, that we took on and tried to adopt in various ways. But first-class infrastructure in the areas of degradation sends such a powerful message. And your focus on natural surveillance through urban design. Anyways, you're going to add one more point, I think.
One more thing is, I just say, it's not just to have great infrastructure, because we made some fantastic libraries, which is a fantastic school or a fantastic library that is an amazing, big, beautiful library in the very low income neighborhood. It's a symbol that we have trust in the intelligence, the capacity of the children, that they can be Nobel Prize or whatever. But I'd say much of the things that we do to construct equality means conflict. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yes,
conflict. Yes. you know, it's a huge conflict. It's very easy to come here and tell you in 30 seconds, but to get cars off, it takes space away from cars to give to public transport, for example.
Yeah.
This almost anything that you do is, and of course, I'm telling you of the battles that I won, but many we lost.
No, indeed. And that was exactly the second point, is that none of this comes easy and that there are going to be tensions and conflicts across the board. So much there, but I don't want to keep extemporizing. I'm going to hand over to you, Michael, to perhaps take us also through your experience with a couple of innovations, and then we're going to slide quickly to Stephanie and on to Sameh if he's got some closing reflections from the bank's perspective about how to finance this. Then we're going to wrap up and hand over to our co-chair, Jean-Marie, to open this up for questions for the last sort of 20 minutes. So over to you, Michael.
Well, Robert, thank you. And, you know, it was Mayor Peñalosa was taking me down memory lane with many of the things that he was talking about. We had one of the most inclusive bike share programs in the United States of America. For instance, when we finally did it, it was later than I wanted, but you know, sometimes, as they say, good things come to those who wait. Ours was the first major city to not require a credit card in order to access the bikes, and it was fascinating to watch how much they were being used over the years. But when the pandemic hit, you know, to some extent, a lot of people abandoned public transportation. They went to the bikes, and the bikes were situated in all the neighborhoods of the city, not just Center City, as the mayor talked about, the wealthy areas. They were in communities all across the city because we insisted on that. The infrastructure pieces, planting trees, open space, cleaning up vacant lots. There's a Wharton study from a few years back, University of Pennsylvania Wharton School study that shows that planting trees and cleaning vacant lots actually led to a decrease in crime, increase in public safety. You talked earlier, Robert, about, as a leader, as the CEO, if you will, of your city, regardless of size, you have to have a vision. You have to share that vision. You have to paint that picture. You have to demonstrate to people how things can be, not just how they are. Public safety is not just the responsibility of the Philadelphia Police Department or the New York City Police Department or the Chicago Police Department. Parks and Recreation have a role to play. Building permit people have a role to play. The Commerce Department and Economic Development has a role to play. And so what I try to convey is that every department and agency in the government has a public safety responsibility. And as we've seen time and time and time again, something happens. People call 911. We send a person with a badge, a gun, maybe a taser, a baton, and handcuffs to solve every problem here in society, when in many instances, we're actually sending the wrong person or the person that does not have the necessary skill set for that circumstance and situation. If I've got a man with his shirt off screaming in the middle of the street, maybe disrupting traffic or something like that, clearly the person is having a mental episode. They're not necessarily a danger to other folks or even themselves. And so we now see the need for a better integrated public safety, public health, mental health systems across the United States of America. We know that law enforcement need increased training and different kinds of training. De-escalation is as important as your ability to either use your weapon or other skills. But if your primary training is on the weapon, then when conflict happens, that's what you're going to default to. And we've seen so many times situations escalate and leading to a death of that citizen when clearly other skills were needed. And so, that was our focus in Philadelphia. How do we create a public safety environment and a public safety agenda that is inclusive and that helped to drive, again, murders and shootings down to levels we hadn't seen since 1967. We were not perfect. We made mistakes. And you also have to be clear and transparent with the public. This proposal or item or idea, this worked. This one didn't. So we're going to stop doing what doesn't work and move on to something else. And so I think communications is critically important and often underrated in the public realm. So I think I'll stop there, and I know we're going to have some Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Leadership, vision, fighting battles, talking about co-benefits in an era of deficits and financial constraints. A lot of big messages coming out of this session. We're going to pivot now to the Q&A with the indulgence of Stephanie and Sameh, who are going to be weaving in some more reflections in their reactions to some of the questions on the floor. And if we have a moment, we'll give each of our panelists a chance to give sort of a minute of kind of final reflections at the end. So with that, let me hand over, Jean-Marie, to you to perhaps canvass the floor for any questions. And if we can't, maybe you could either repeat the question or give the mic directly to your participant. I'm sure there's a protocol that you have for this.
Yes, no, well, thank you very much to the panel for the fantastic discussion. And what strikes me is how, on the one hand, these cities are very different, and yet there are issues that you find in Freetown, Philadelphia, Bogota. Who could think of more different cities? And that's what I think is very interesting. So without further ado, the questions, and if you can orient your questions to the solutions so that we'll give a chance to the panelists to answer. So first, you, Alper, and you introduce yourself for the panelists so that they know.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You can take your mask off when you speak.
So my name is Alper Sezer. I'm from the Turkish mission here to the UN. And my question also relates to the solutions of some of the issues that we face in urban environments. So listening to Ms. Stephanie and Yvonne especially, I got flashbacks to my previous posting in Tripoli in Libya, where we also had like a very difficult environment with different gangs and militia groups that vie for power and control different areas of the city. So I wanted to know more, like what is being done on a national level to overcome this cycle of violence, and if it is being assisted on international level as well, perhaps like through a DDR process, and how effective this was in terms of reaching their objectives thus far. Thank you.
Jean-Marie, we'll take a few questions.
Next, a few questions.
Okay,
And then
right.
go to the panel. Huh?
Yeah.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Isis Gonzalez. I'm from the permanent mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the UN. Starting with Haiti, and I will get to a solution, I promise, or part of a solution. Violence, we have to remember, is the history of Haiti from the time of brutal and illegal conquest, and a history which went on for hundreds of years. So underdevelopment is the legacy of this. And we know, well, the New York Times recently woke up and wrote a series on reparations that were paid by Haiti to France, and which are yet to be paid back to Haiti. Separate and apart from that, the rest of us in CARICOM, the Caribbean community, have an active, ongoing case for reparations against former colonial powers. Even though the rest of us did not actually pay reparations, we have grounds to request this. So I think that reparations should be a part of the solution, a part of any package that would be a solution for Haiti. And I'd be curious to know your response to this. And Stephanie rightly pointed out, I hope I'm not misquoting you here, but that the political and business elites in the country do play a role. But I think that too much focus, I agree, but too much focus on that without recognizing the role and the continued role of historic and continued role of external players can lead us down a difficult path. So also, I would be curious to know your views on the role of neighbors in helping Haiti, such as Dominican Republic and Caribbean community. Of course, we need the neighbors to be involved, but we also need further afield from the external players, morally sound interventions, good intentions from those with the resources, particularly those who have benefited handsomely from Haiti's vast wealth. While including the neighbors. So that is my point about Haiti. And if I may just ask the former mayor of Philadelphia, in the American context, which is a different context, about reparations here as a tool for development of some inner city areas. And I know that you mentioned race as a factor. So that's one question. And finally, from the mayor of Sierra Leone, we heard about the bleak picture being painted of violence, and that this violence is increasing as the economy shrinks. So a lot of the time we focus on solutions that deal with domestic management or mismanagement. My question is, and I'm happy that the World Bank is here too, how can we, and when I say we, I mean those of us who are not in the G7 or the G20, those of us who are on the periphery of decision-making when it comes to the global financial architecture, how can we deal with the exogenous shocks and externally created problems, as well as dealing with domestic management issues as well. So my colleague has a question as well.
Thank you to all of our panelists. My name is Chris. I'm an American diplomat, and I'm also a SIPA alum. It's great to see Professor Nutter on camera. I thought Mayor Peñalosa's comments were spot on, particularly when he mentioned that when there is legitimacy with the state's institutions, laws are more often obeyed. My question is really for those, whether you're a mayor or you are a resident coordinator of your UN agency in a country, either way, your mandate is limited and you have a defined period of time in which to do the work. And I find that in societies and communities in which there is larger inequality, the challenge is that much more profound, and the need to have results is that much more important to get those results quicker. So how do you engage, or what is your strategy when you have a limited mandate with a defined time period? What is your strategy for engaging civil society to help drive results in terms of public safety? And civil society could be defined as, I take a broad definition, whether that's neighborhood associations, nonprofits, or even gangs. Thank you.
One last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks to all the speakers. I will be very short. I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with youth? We just recently had at the UN a high-level debate on how we can mainstream youth into crime prevention, and I'm talking about the prevention part. So I just wanted to ask you how you see youth being involved in the designing and in the implementation of your policies, and also taking into advantage the green and digital transition that we all face now. Of course, I'm a woman, so I want to add also the gender part into the equation here. And finally, just to inform that from the EU, I'm Tizvek Majoglu from the EU delegation. So I just want to praise what the EU is doing a little bit here. It's the youth year, this year, 2022. So we have already established a youth sounding board composed of 25 young people from across the world, and they advise our high representatives in the European Commission on how to design policies and be also involved across all the policies. So this is a mainstream example. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Robert. And I
Great.
would ask the panelists to be as concise as possible so that we can have another round of questions, possibly, because I see that there are many more questions.
Great. Then let me simply say, I'll hand over to the panelists as they wish to react to whichever questions there were. And just to repeat, there was one on how to deal with the challenges of gangs in cities. How do we think about reparations in the Haitian context and the role of neighbors, as well as potentially one on the reparations in the context of community action in the United States. How do small states and cities deal with exogenous shocks? How do you sustain engagement over time, especially across civil society, especially given your limited mandates? And then finally, this question of youth involvement and solutions. One small point, Yvonne had to, being a mayor and a busy one, had to dash off to hold an emergency press conference on some crisis that I think mayors know all about that happen on a regular basis. So she's unfortunately not with us just this moment, but she will come back hopefully if she can deal with her press conference. So she may not be able to answer. But why don't we hand it over first to you, Enrique, and then we'll go through the panelists to give some quick reactions and we can do another round.
I just very much in an organized way. Michael mentioned about the national policies for these kind of issues, not just local policies. And I'd like to mention that in Colombia, there was a peace process with the FARC guerrillas. And of course, in Colombia, we have a big problem with crime because of the drug production and export and all of that. I mean, the fact that, and this is a long story, I'm not going to it, but the fact is that the areas where there was no drug production, the peace has been extremely successful. And also there is some programs complementary to the peace treaty, which increase very significantly national investment in the poorest municipalities of Colombia. All of these things, so the national government also is very important for many of these things. ISIS mentioned something, if I understood well, about the fact that people were the colonial powers and the damage that the colonial powers did to societies. There is something that it's always impressed me is that there is a book a book that is called Voyagers. I am not pronouncing it well. Voyagers to the West. It's about the American colonization, not of the California and all that, but more the Appalachian region and all this between 1750 and 1800, something like that. And there were millions of Europeans who went to the United States from all over, not only England, but from France, Germany, Sweden. I mean, and each family, they really went there to work. They were going into areas which were dangerous because of Indian attacks and all this. And they were going there to really, they themselves work with their hands. There was no, and this was millions of immigrants. In Colombia, there was not one single Spaniard who arrived, whoever took a hoe, whoever thought it crossed his mind that they would work with their hands for anything. They would only have other people exploited, Indians or blacks or whatever, African. And so this, of course, has a legacy of inequality in our societies. And in societies where there was the least organized Indian communities is where there is more equality in Latin America, such as Chile or Costa Rica or things. So this is a legacy that is difficult to overcome. And we all have these issues, not so much from exploitation of the colonial power. This is not the issue in my opinion, but more from the inequality that it leaves as a legacy. Which is the biggest problem that we still have. I mean that equality is a long issue to talk about. Now, about the last question about civil society, I would like to say that as he mentioned, Chris mentioned, is that it's very short terms, and this not, of course, one should try to persuade everybody that about the new projects, but it's always inevitable to have conflict. And we have, of course, the city council, and Bogota is divided in 20 localities, and each locality elects also a small sort of city council for the locality. And these are the elected officials are important to contact with the community. There is also community organizations, and we do as much as we can to talk to these communities. But mostly the conflict we had was with powerful people in a higher income people who have cars, or even, for example, we got the most exclusive country club in the country, which is called the Country Club. UN expropriated the polo fields in order to do, and that's where the biggest millionaires and former presidents and everything are members, and we expropriated these polo fields to make a public park. And this is just like the most symbolic thing that we did, perhaps, but there are many things. All I'm just trying to say, it's not possible to think that we are going to get everybody in agreement. The one who is in government must have very clear what is it that they want to do, and they have a short time to do it. And of course, it must be the result of many years of thinking, studying, and preparing. And then you just have to give the fights to do it. And people may hate you at first, and then afterwards they will love it in most cases. But if you just want to be nice and everybody to love you, you will not do anything.
Really good points. And to continue the trend of being unloved, can I ask Stephanie to speak next, and we're going to try to sort of sharpen our responses to see if there's possibly a final round. But Stephanie, there were a lot of questions there devoted to the Haitian experience and beyond. So over to you, and then we'll go to Michael, and then finally Sameh will close us.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert, and thank you, colleagues in the room, for your questions. And I think, we all work in different ways into, international civil service or in civil service of some sort. So I would like to believe that this vocation of ours calls us to have morally sound approaches to the work that we do. That being said, I'm not naive to, the political dimensions of our work, politics, small p, politics, large p, and the limitations of what we can do. But I think if I look at the Haitian situation right now, we are compelled, all of us, whether it's UN actors, bilaterals, multilaterals, national, local government, civil society, to take a hard look at what's happening and to really try to coordinate amongst ourselves to tackle the issue. Because like, my colleague from St. Vincent and the Grenadines mentioned, what we're seeing now is the consequence of a number of factors, whether they're structural, it's the legacy of the birth of this nation in Haiti. It's its place in the constellation of international affairs, and having been, I would say, caught in different situations where Haiti didn't have necessarily the leverage to withstand external pressures. So what we see now is the manifestation of this. And that brings me a little bit to what can we do? It's often very easy and I'm speaking as, UNDP and as an international development, actor, sometimes it's easy to go for the low-hanging fruit. And sometimes that means focusing on the easiest problems to solve within the time frame of our projects, right? And unfortunately, that sometimes has a geospatial dynamic where we look at, let's look at the rural areas. Maybe some of the issues are less complex, we'll get more traction. And we've neglected this urban space that is sometimes far more complex and is a reflection of inequalities that we see throughout the country. And the urban nature of the violence that we're seeing now is extremely difficult to tackle. So I think that we have a collective responsibility with regard to Haiti to tackle what's happening in Port-au-Prince in particular, because it is having repercussions on the rest of the country. We have deepening food insecurity, exacerbated multidimensional poverty happening throughout the country because of what's happening in this city. So we have to act in the urban space to support those who are living outside of the urban space, as well as those who are living within the urban space. So I don't want to neglect kind of the urban nature of what's happening right now. I think the question of what could be the role of neighbors, I think that's a very good question. In a context of political instability, which we have now, I think solidarity is extremely important. I think listening, even though there is a deep governance challenge in the country, there are national priorities. There are national priorities that were here before the deepening of the political and security crisis, and that will remain the same after. And we can't forget those. And that brings me a little bit to this question of how do we support civil society in all of its forms. I think is extremely important for us as international players and as the UN to listen to those voices, to support those voices to formulate their agendas when it comes to advocacy, to creating the space, facilitating dialogue. It's not easy. It's not easy, and it becomes politically charged, but it's work that has to be done side by side with some of the other things that other panelists have addressed, which have to do with supporting the police, very technical work, supporting more traditional security approaches, but sustaining and supporting national and local priorities, no matter what is happening in the context around us, and supporting actors to formulate those priorities too, where it's necessary. I think that has to be done, and that needs to be done regardless of what your mandate is, regardless of what your project budget is, and regardless of whether you're going to see the fruit of your work or not. I think we need to be increasingly selfless in the approach to the work that we do in Haiti. And Robert, I know I won't have much of a chance to talk about some of the efforts, successful or not, that we've engaged in probably the last 10 to 15 years on community violence reduction. Some of the approaches are modeled on elsewhere in Central America. We've learned quite a bit, from Colombia and elsewhere. I think there's still a lot of work to do. And I think one of the limiting factors to the success of community violence reduction approaches is the persistent institutional crisis and political crisis, because you can get traction to a certain extent at a community level with community actors, but if that doesn't get linked with what's happening at a medium and a higher scale within national and regional institutions of a country, the results aren't going to stick. You're not going to get an uptick, and you're not going to get expansion of intervention. So if there's a chance to go into more detail in that regard, happy to do so. I think we have a lot of lessons learned and still a long way to go. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephanie. Over to you, Michael.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. I'm going to try to remember a few of the questions. First and foremost, the New York Times piece on Haiti. There was certainly a lot of detail in there that I was not aware of. I just have to admit that up front. Having said that, that was one of the most outrageous and offensive situations. The whole idea of having to pay for your independence and your freedom, and from which the country is still suffering, as detailed in the article. In terms of reparations, active discussion here in the United States. I have hope, given the report and the work that's being done in California. We've seen some activity in Evanston, Illinois, and it is a real discussion here in the United States of America. We need to keep that momentum going. Clearly, there is inequality, and increasingly, we need to help people to better understand that equal and equity are not the same words. They're not the same thing. They start out with the same first three letters, but after that, there's a big difference between those, and there are numerous examples. It always strikes me when we talk about, especially in the United States, a country, kind of created out of conflict, as we try to throw off, of course, our British oppressors, while at the same time, the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, which was just not true at the time. So folks are writing this, glowing language. I love my country. This is where I am. I'm real American, but we have to be serious about this, right? Those words are being written while Africans were enslaved. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Give me a break. So just need to be honest about, where we've been, where we are, and where we're trying to go. In terms of gang violence, often that really does require a multi-level response. city, state, and federal. And one of the things we did to deal with either gangs, large organizations, whatever the case may be, we've got a ton of support from the federal government, specifically the Department of Justice, and taking those folks to another level of conspiracy or RICO or some of those tools, and literally taking a number of people off the street at the same time, which often does help on the public safety side. Lastly, in terms of overall agenda, have a focus, make a plan, stick with the plan. I thought, again, the mayor's comments, if you try to please everybody, you will please no one. And that is a complete and utter waste of time. If you need to be loved and admired, politics is not for you. You should go work in a pet shop. And so having a level of coordination and focus and commitment with metrics and measurables and holding yourself accountable to the public, depending on the office, especially on the executive side, you're fortunate to get 4 years in most of our cities, and you're really lucky if you get 8. But it's 8 years in the context of hundreds of years of history. Governor Bob Casey, and I'll close with this, often said, what did you do when you had the power? What did you do when you had the power? You're not going to solve all these problems in 4 years, 8 years, 20 years. Do your part. It's like a relay race. Not that I've ever run one, but I've seen a lot on TV, right? You run your leg, hand off the baton, next person goes, they do their thing. But what did you do when you had the power? I think should be a driving force for folks, and a mindset of just getting stuff done, making things happen, do your best, and then move on, get out of the way.
It's the mayor's mantra, getting stuff done. Thank you for that. That was really concise. And thank you to all our speakers so far. We have one more. For packing a lot into your short responses. That's not easy, and I really appreciate the agility and the spirit with which you're approaching this. Sameh, take us home. We're at the 10:30 mark. I don't want to trespass onto our panelist time, and I know that the participants for this session have a busy schedule, but please give us some of your thoughts and reflections, and we'll kind of move towards close.
So 2 quick points. One on how to deal with exogenous shocks in small island states and to bring the financing solutions home. So we have at the World Bank a line of credit called CADDDO. It stands for Catastrophic Deferred Drawdown Option. So it's a development policy loan that basically provides financing in the form of a line of credit against basically reforms that help the country advance the risk reduction and the risk preparedness dynamics. It usually deals with natural hazards, so the rapid onset, floods, cyclones, etc., the slow onset like droughts, seismic hazard, and pandemics. And in these cases, as a country invests in measures to reduce the risk, like climate proofing its infrastructure, like investing or preparedness, like for instance in early warning systems or hydromet type information. Of course, these reforms would have an important impact in terms of reducing the impact from future risk. And in return for this investment, the country has this line of credit on standby that's activated whenever a hazard or basically a disaster ensues, and there's a declaration of of a national emergency. So, I mean, this type of line of credit is both an incentive for improvements in risk reduction and preparedness, and avails the financing so a country doesn't have to go and cannibalize its health and education budgets, etc. The second point I wanted to make is on the issue of the short time frame. When a mayor has 4 years, what do you do? What we found, and especially when we're dealing with complex issues, when you're trying to reform a complex sector, like let's say solid waste management or municipal finances, etc., and you really want to work with the city, you're not going to be able to tackle, because you haven't worked with them before. So we usually try to start with some sort of a quick win, So in the case of urban crime and violence, we do some public space improvements, some, small scale interventions that can be implemented rapidly, that can create the trust with the various stakeholders, with the mayor, with local council, with public and private sectors, etc., and get everybody on the table so that we can agree on a program of reform for the more complex stuff that will have to transcend basically municipal administrations. Mayor might get re-elected, the results are happening on the ground, then you've got more time frame to prepare things. Mayor might not get re-elected, but there's enough if you will, galvanization of stakeholders that could maybe carry through that agenda. We found that this works usually in the context of the more complex places, the Karachis and Dhakas and Kairos of this world. Back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Sameh. And it's such an important point to close on, I think. I mean, this emphasis on having a vision, having a plan, having leadership, not making friends, choosing your battles. But I think you're landing on a solution. This speaks to Stephanie's point as well about the challenges of sustaining activities in a situation of flux. But strategies that have co-benefits, interventions that can appeal to multiple outcomes that you can measure and demonstrate and provide evidence of success in relatively short periods is incredibly important to build that momentum. And when I listen to Enrique and I think about the strategies in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, or the knots, that were about greening a particular community, or promoting bicycling, or getting cars off the street, or addressing the size of curbs, or rechanging buildings and the built environment. All of those have incredibly important equity outcomes and have incredibly important growth potential outcomes and build social efficacy and social cohesion. But at the same time, they have very strong crimogenic outcomes as well. And those are increasingly being demonstrated through good research and RCTs and randomized controlled trials that people are doing research on. So I think it's really important to be creative. And the good news is that cities are these platforms for that kind of creativity and innovation and experimentation. And we had the real privilege, I personally had a great privilege of seeing 4 stars of mine and heroes really set out in a very rapid fire manner some reflections. And I thank you all, our panelists, for giving of your time and your energy and for your commitment and your service and for playing along with this exercise of talking about big issues and condensing them into short snippets. And I want to thank our participants as well for some really thought-provoking and provocative questions, and wish all of you remotely and in person a successful continuation of your event. And with that, Jean-Marie, can I hand back to you to perhaps transition us out?
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you to all our panelists. I think myself, I learned a lot from this panel. And one of the ideas I will keep is the need to build constituencies for change. And you start with small projects, but that creates the momentum that then can be scaled up. And at the same time, the more worrying concern is that you need to, with the micro effort, needs to be complemented by structural change that is not always under your control. And that's where it gets really difficult. But I think we got a measure of the difficulties, but also a sense of what the direction for solution is. And so thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to the moderators. And my conclusion is really we should spend a week on those issues or more rather than an hour and a half. Thank you.